Thank you so much, Ricardo, and good morning, everyone. It really is my pleasure to welcome you this morning to our Implicit Bias webinar series. We are super excited to have Gretchen Robertson and Kip Zwolenski from Skagit Valley College with us this morning. And I'm here just briefly to offer an overview, a little bit more about who we are as the Institute leadership team, what the Workforce Implicit Bias Institute really is, and a few additional training opportunities that you can count on, not only the rest of the spring, summer, and beyond. The Institute leadership team is comprised of representation from 4 of our Washington State Centers of Excellence, as well as the Machinist Institute. So we've got a team of 5 here. And especially for those that maybe are joining us for the first time or just really aren't even familiar with the Implicit Bias Institute, it's really a professional development pathway that we have created over the last couple of years. Created in response to the rapidly changing workforce demographics. It was also designed not only for Washington's community and technical colleges, but also the apprenticeship and K-12 communities. It's a series of training opportunities, both in person and virtual. Up until last year, we were strictly in person, and then we had to pivot knowing that we were not going to be able to meet in person anymore. So we moved ahead on creating a virtual series of webinars, and I'll give you a little bit more information on those here in just a minute. And what do the institutes really provide? Most importantly, we would say a foundational understanding of implicit bias. Also, significant opportunities for personal reflection and growth, and learning about strategies to reduce those biases, the things that impact our everyday decision making, things that we aren't even aware of. Also, we provide all different levels of training opportunity, not only these introductory webinar series, but also in-person, different cycles of training, cycles 1 all the way up through 4. More information to come on those as soon as we are able to resume in-person trainings next year. And this is a look at the webinar series that we have in place. We've had in place since February. We've hosted 2 already. Happy to have you here with us today. And we have 2 more coming, one in May and another in June. We are busy planning for a series to occur this summer and beyond. So look for more information to be shared there. It's also our great hope and intention to resume our in-person learning just as soon as we can. And so we'll share information on that as soon as we have it, and as soon as we have the clearance to resume in person, I should say. So again, it's my pleasure to welcome Gretchen and Kip with us today. We had them come and present at one of the more recent in-person sessions, trainings that we hosted at Kent campus. People absolutely loved the information that they shared and strongly encouraged us to bring them back. We want to learn more. We want to bring our colleagues in to hear the same message. So we were thrilled to be able to include them today in our webinar series. And please stick around towards the end if you have questions. Also, as Ricardo said, please take a second to take the survey at the very end. We would greatly appreciate your feedback. And without further ado, Kip and Gretchen, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Great, thanks so much. So as we switch over to our slideshow, if you haven't already, chime in the chat and share your name, the institution you work at, which program, and then we're doing a would you rather. Would you rather be covered in scales or feathers? And as you have seen, there are some benefits to those different coverings, but there is not a guarantee of gills or flight. They are just coverings, so please chime in and I will get our presentation up. So we are really happy for the opportunity to be here with you today. We wish we were there in person because some of the best conversations happen in the small group discussions or after the session. To that end, we are going to stick around at the end. So if you want to check in with us and have more of a discussion with us, feel free. But we're going to move pretty quick because we have an hour to go through this content. So this is an overview and introduction to inclusive pedagogy. And we're going to talk a little bit about what we've been doing at Skagit, but then what it means for you as an individual faculty member, and ultimately how you can lead these efforts on your own campus.
And we just want to thank the organizers of this series. It's such an honor to be able to present alongside the other presenters. And we really just think this series is an incredible opportunity for practitioners. So I know a lot of work goes into it, and it's just a joy to be here. So thank you. So we're going to start by sharing a little bit of a context as to how we got here in front of you today. And Kip and I are part of the Center for Participatory Excellence at Skagit Valley College. And that center actually started out of our work that was faculty led at the time to train faculty in inclusive pedagogy. So I started out at Skagit about 17 years ago, and I started in basic education for adults. So for those of you who don't know, that's a program that is for students who have been through transition or trauma and need to work on their basic skills to go into college level courses. And at the time, our beta program was ranked at about 22nd out of 44 colleges for student achievement. And so I started to look into inclusive pedagogy as a means to improve those numbers. And so by applying inclusive pedagogy strategies to my classroom and working with other faculty, we were able to move from 22nd to about 4th in the state, which was pretty exciting. And based on that work, admin noticed what was happening and asked if I would train other faculty through a learning group on inclusive pedagogy campus-wide. To which I responded, absolutely not. That sounds terrifying. The thought of having those really difficult conversations with my colleagues about race and privilege and equity just absolutely terrified me, with good reason. I had had some conversations with faculty in the past that hadn't really gone that well. So that was my initial response, and then I slept on it. And I came back and I thought, well, even if I'm to get students through the basic education for adults program, unless we really transform the classrooms and power dynamics at the college level, those students are going to stall out. And in fact, we had a lot of evidence that that's what was happening. So I agreed to run a faculty learning group, and Kip actually was a participant the first year I ran it. And then I asked him to co-facilitate with me. So that was kind of the beginning of the center. And, it was a little nerve-wracking at first because I didn't really see myself as an expert in inclusive pedagogy. But what I came to learn is that I did have the ability to offer a model for other faculty. So I was someone who was, just kind of starting out in my practice. I was terrified. I didn't really know, what I should be doing, but I was willing to ask the tough questions, and I was willing to fail. So, I think that throughout this presentation, we're going to ask you all to not only think about inclusive pedagogy in your own classroom, but think about the opportunity to be a leader at your institution as well. And then I'm going to have Kip chime in and talk a little bit about how the center has grown since those early days.
Yeah, so that internal work quickly resulted in us being asked to speak at different conferences, such as the Assessment, Teaching and Learning Conference, and some of the Student Success Institutes leading the Guided Pathways conversation in our state. And we shared what we were doing there, and quickly were asked to speak on campuses or help other faculty facilitate learning groups on their campus. And so we started prior to the COVID shutdown. We had 2 summer faculty institutes, which were essentially a leader training model, but also an immersive experience in the learning groups that we did on our own campus. And out of that, we formalized the structure and created the Center for Participatory Excellence. And to give a quick overview of what that is for us, and also a foundation for what we're going to be talking about today, we have this slide. So we look at our activities as fitting into these 3 topics.
So the first kind of goal of the center is to disrupt existing power and privilege structures. So we believe that learning can't take place for all students and instructors at institutions that maintain historical structures of knowledge, privilege, and power. So we feel like this is a really important role that the center plays.
And an element of that I wanted to add is that it's disrupting, policies and procedures on our campus that keep the status quo as it is, but it's also interrupting the internal. So it's the work, the reflection we do to look at our own implicit bias, to look at our own pedagogy and what can be changed to better include students in the curriculum.
The next goal is to engage all actors at our institution in this work. So I'm sure some of you have experienced this where you show up to a training on equity and it's the same players time and time again. And that's what we were experiencing when we first started this work. And we realized that in order for meaningful, sustainable change to happen, it needs to be a professional responsibility taken on by everyone at the institution. So we've looked at creating structures for staff and admin and faculty alike, and really making sure that we're engaging all folks, regardless of their ideology, their race, or their views in equity work. And then finally, we think it's really critical to provide the support. So this is really challenging work for all of us. And I think oftentimes it's uncompensated work. We expect folks to take on a workload without a lot of guidance or support. So we are really intentional about providing support for faculty and staff and admin to really engage in this inquiry and practice.
And
go ahead, Kip.
Okay, I was just going to lead with this quote from Estella Ben-Simone. I view inequality in educational outcomes as a learning problem of institutional actors, faculty members, administrators, counselors, and others, rather than as a learning problem of students. So that shift in how we perceive the learning problem is really at the core of how we present on inclusive pedagogy. So as you'll see, we also draw on Ben-Simone's work quite a bit. So we wanted to lead with this quote to center us in that work. And today, our objectives will be that you understand what it means to be a first-generation equity practitioner. So that is a term from Ben-Simone that we'll go into. Understand inclusive pedagogy critical threshold concepts and how they play out in the classroom. And this is twofold. One, that you understand the concepts so that you can implement change in your classroom. And two, so that you can investigate what threshold concepts are needed on your campus to move this work forward. And then finally, understand the importance of onboarding the whole campus community in the work of equity. So we looked at that a second ago with engaging, and that we really need the full student experience to take into account the concepts of equity. So if there's all the changes in the classroom would be great, but if we still aren't leading with equity in our student services, in our business office, then it's not going to have that systemic change that's required. So we need to onboard our whole campus.
You'll notice with these objectives that you're not getting a checklist of how to do inclusive pedagogy. So we believe that inclusive pedagogy is an ongoing critical awareness that takes a lot of work and energy. So what we want to do today is really provide you with a framework to start thinking about inclusive pedagogy. We're going to ask that you identify some really critical practices, but I just want you to know that, this is an ongoing thing. Lots of times people will ask us for a checklist so that they can go back to their curriculum and just kind of check off the boxes. And we wish that were possible, but we really believe that it's more of a process that's iterative and ongoing. So we always like to share this from the state board's mission statement because it really helps us to see ourselves as collective practitioners. When we first began this work, this statement wasn't available. And so we were constantly trying to encourage our peers to join us. It was kind of like, hey, come do this lunch thing with us and talk about equity because we're a lot of fun. And that only got us so far. But when the state board came out with this statement, we could finally say, hey, this is our job. It's our professional responsibility to attend to racial equity. So just as a reminder, the state board says that we're leading with racial equity, our college maximize student potential and transform lives within a culture of belonging that advances racial, social, and economic justice in service to our diverse communities.
So one more slide on the context. So this work began, as you can see in the lower left-hand corner, with our inclusive pedagogy faculty learning communities, which were part of this overall student achievement strategy. So as one of the first colleges in our system to receive funding to go down the pathway of guided pathways, this was our framework for making the changes on our campus. As we talked about the center and our work, how it's grown, instead of just being within this one pillar of equity and inclusion, these learning groups have expanded to be included in all other areas of campus to help faculty and staff grapple with what it means to really change an institution. This may look similar to some of the activities on your campus around guided pathways, but we really just want to point out how equity at the center has been a shift from us from the beginning of, instead of just a strategy of student achievement, it's that the goal of student achievement is to reach equity.
So like I said before, Kip and I were kind of voluntold that we were going to be in charge of that pillar around equity and inclusion. And when we first started out, I was kind of going, I kind of felt like it was an impossible task. And I thought, how are we going to get everyone on campus to actually participate and do this work? And so, Kip and I went back and forth for a long time. He would say, we just need to give them the strategies. And I would say, well, I think we need to attend to the emotions and the ideology so that people will actually step up and do it. And we kind of landed on the idea that it's a little bit of both, or a lot of both, really. And Ben Simone's framework really helped us to communicate that responsibility. So Ben Simone talks about equity-minded practitioners, and equity-minded practitioners, first of all, they call attention to inequities. And that's a little bit of a shift, I think, for most faculty. So instead of just thinking, my sphere is my classroom, I'm responsible for what happens in my classroom, it's really going, oh, I see some inequities happening around me, either in my classroom or outside of the classroom, and I need to call attention to them. So a really great example on our campus is our tutoring center, which used to only be available to students who were college level. And so it was excluding our basic education for adult students, our ELA and beta students. And so we had faculty who recognized that, they called it out, and they worked with student services and admin to find funding so that we could make that tutoring center available to the students who really needed it. The next thing that equity-minded practitioners do is they assume responsibility for the elimination of inequity. So they're not only calling attention to it, but they're assuming responsibility. And instead of just kind of thinking, oh, that's someone else's job, they really take the time to eliminate inequities.
So the example that we share for this one is working with undocumented students. So in our state, as many of you may be aware, we've got the WASFA. So that is the Washington State financial aid that is available to students without documentation, unlike the federal financial aid. And so obviously, our educational system or us as individual teachers are not going to help change the full, or be able to change the full immigration issue, but we can take responsibility for the aspects of how it affects our students. And so many years ago, we had the legislation to make that funding available to them. And then we also mirror those projects on our campus to provide support for those students.
And then the last thing that equity-minded practitioners do is that they focus on practitioners, not the shortcomings of students. And a good example of this is, if students don't do well on a essay that a faculty is assigned, instead of the faculty member thinking, well, that's because the students didn't try hard enough, or they're lazy, or even valid excuses like homelessness, the faculty member would go, well, was I clear in my grading criteria? What can I do to help students be successful regardless of where they're coming from? So this is a really major shift. We use this framework with our faculty to kind of standardize language and approach. And this is what we're asking you will do today. We want you to think of yourself as an equity-minded practitioner.
So with that foundation, we're going to move into the changes in your classroom. So namely inclusive pedagogy. What is it? It's the method and practice of teaching that promotes equity in the classroom and beyond. What it does, and the first bullet is very important, but it's been the focus of changes in the classroom for the past many years, is the utilization of diverse teaching strategies, multicultural content, and varied means of student assessment. What we want to draw attention to is that it's not just that it also requires uncovering the inequities in student success. And so there's many ways to do that within your classroom and within your institution, but it's that critical awareness piece that's key to inclusive pedagogy.
Okay, so in order to do those things, we realized that we needed to do some teaching with our actors at our institution. And we started talking about the threshold concepts that would help faculty to make that leap into inclusive pedagogy. And I love talking about threshold concepts. Threshold concepts are incredible, incredibly powerful. And I use them as a teacher with my students, and I've started to use them in my role as a dean as well. So a threshold concept is a concept that once it's understood, it transforms a person's perception of a subject, another concept, or experience. So it's like a gateway concept that allows students to build their schema of the bigger picture of a discipline or a topic. And so we brainstormed some examples of threshold concepts specific to disciplines, just so that you can kind of get an understanding of what a threshold concept is. And then we'll talk about how we started looking at threshold concepts as really critical to equity and inclusive pedagogy. So some examples of threshold concepts in economics, we've got opportunity cost. So unless students understand that concept of opportunity cost, they're not going to understand a multitude of other economic concepts. In biology, you've got evolution. English, which is my background, you have perspective. And I'll let Kip talk about the last one because that's from his discipline, early childhood education. But I do have to share with you, it was pretty hilarious when Kip and I were trying to brainstorm threshold concepts for different disciplines. It really kind of reemphasized the idea that, those threshold concepts are really critical to the discipline. So we were like, well, economics, what's an important concept in economics? And I was like, money? I don't know. But we came up with this list. So Kip, you want to talk about early childhood ed?
So I'm going to share one from my discipline and go a little more into detail with it, because we're going to ask that you share out your discipline and a threshold concept that you utilize in your discipline in the chats. So I teach teachers in the early childhood education setting, and ACEs, which is an acronym for Adverse Childhood Experiences, is really changing our field. So going back to once understood, a threshold concept transforms a person's perception of a subject. So those adverse experiences in childhood change everything that we do in our field. So be it our understanding of childhood development and how those experiences affect that, what we're doing with the curriculum to support students that experience ACEs, or even concepts around behavior management, that there's reasons behind a child's behavior that might not be on the surface, and that our behavior management needs to reflect that and not just be punitive. So take a moment, we'll just take a minute or two, and in the chats, list your field and a threshold concept that is key to understanding your field. And make sure as you share them that you're choosing all panelists and attendees so that we can see them. Great.
I love this activity because I love to see the diversity in threshold concepts, and it makes me want to go back to school.
Yeah, we were back to our anecdote of trying to think of threshold concepts, jokingly, I was like, we were trying to find one in the humanities, and I was like, color for art? So I really appreciate everyone chiming in with actual threshold concepts with your expertise. So keep sending those in because this is recorded. So we're going to get all those in the notes that download. And it's really helpful for us in our presentations to be able to share this. And I think it's really important too, as we build on this work in the implicit bias workshops, how to link different concepts together. So how to contextualize the threshold concept in your field in a new way to reinforce ideas around inclusive pedagogy.
So relating threshold concepts to inclusive pedagogy, we worked with faculty to identify a few threshold concepts that we really wanted to focus on in the learning group. And so the first one that we came up with is opportunity gap. So we realized that especially for our institution, we needed to do some training on what an opportunity gap is, why we call it an opportunity gap as opposed to an achievement gap. So again, taking the responsibility and placing it on the college and the instructors to provide opportunities, and not just assuming that a student isn't able to achieve, but rather saying, what does a student need in order to be successful? Another one is data-driven curriculum. So on our campus, we didn't really have a culture or an understanding of what data-driven curriculum was. So we realized we needed to spend quite a bit of time attending to that threshold concept.
And I would add on that second one, data-driven curriculum, is even just the culture of critiquing our data. When we first started conversations, when we disaggregated data and saw student success rates reflected differently across racial groups, instantly the conversation turned defensive. And so even the way that we interacted with that concept needed to be established. And so that's really speaks to the teaching and learning aspect of this work. Another one that we touch on is explicit enculturation, which really just speaks to the need to explicitly teach the skills necessary to enter into a new cultural setting. And in this case, we're using it to speak to academia. So too often students come to our campuses and we just expect them to know how things work regarding enrollment and registration and financial aid. And so a good example of this is many of our campuses are utilizing the first quarter experience courses to really have a whole course in teaching you how to engage in this new culture. An aspect of this concept that is really exciting to me is by becoming more literate in that new culture, you can engage in it and change it. So that's been a fun one to discuss. And then finally, shared knowledge building, which is a really important one for us to share with you. We love working with Prof Tech faculty because oftentimes our conversations begin with, well, I have so much skills to go through and standards to cover that I can't change my curriculum to in a way that includes inclusive pedagogy. But in our work, we find that it's the Prof Tech people that once they begin this work, make the biggest changes because of this shared knowledge building. So they're bringing students interests and objectives and community problem solving into the core concepts of the classes that are being taught. So
oh, sorry, Kip, I'm going to jump in. So we started with these threshold concepts on our campus, but they've evolved over time. So the idea behind threshold concepts is that everyone who's learning something, everyone who's part of a learning community needs to master the threshold concepts in order to understand all of the whole picture, the whole work. So although we've moved on to other threshold concepts, we don't abandon these ones. And that's been really helpful for us in thinking about how we collaborate with faculty. So as we have a new associate faculty coming on board, new tenure track faculty, we make sure that they've got a grasp of these threshold concepts and then the additional ones that we've decided are really critical to our campus work. Another example of a threshold concept is implicit bias. Or decolonizing curriculum. There's tons of them. So we're not saying that these are the inclusive pedagogy threshold concepts. We're saying here's a few that we focused on early on in our work. one thing about shared language and shared concepts is that they should change and grow over time. And I know that some folks can feel frustrated when they think, oh, well, this is just another educational trend. And we like to say, no, it's good that we're growing and changing and learning. And we're still committed to these threshold concepts that we began with. Or maybe we learned that that threshold concept is out of date and there's a better way to understand the work of equity, then we would look at changing it. But just kind of recognizing that this is fluid and that's okay. And I know that makes some people feel uncomfortable, but we really challenge folks to be willing to learn new threshold concepts as we go.
Great, thank you so much for adding that, Gretchen. So for the next part, we're gonna do a little bit of this activity. So if we were in person, we'd break into small groups and it'd be a ton more interactive. But we're gonna get you started on this, and then you will have resources to either take back for yourself to work on and reflect on your practice, or to use as guiding tools in your own discussions in your department or with your colleagues. So we're going to open up the threshold concept immersion activity. So this was emailed out to you. It's the first attachment to email. You also will be able to find a link to it in the chat. There it is. And so open that up. It's going to open as a PDF. So be sure to have a piece of paper out to do your journaling, because we wanted to send it to you in a clean PDF format so that you could reuse it. All our materials are, oh my goodness, my mind's going blank. Gretchen, help me. Common. You're not going to help me. Okay.
Commons.
Thank you.
Commons.
Thank you. So open the document and you'll notice that there is an introductory description of the threshold concept. You'll read that description. You'll journal your pre-knowledge and about that concept. So we'll take about 4 minutes to do that, and then I'll read through all the instructions. We'll come back to a text excerpt, which is a piece of a larger reading that would be assigned in the learning group. So it's a way to engage with folks who are maybe their week got too busy, they weren't able to do their reading. We can reactivate the schema for folks that did read it. We can bring people into the conversation who didn't have a chance to read it. So you're going to read that short excerpt, and then you're going to record your reactions, questions, and connections. And unfortunately, we're not going to have time or the logistics to share out, but we do want you to go through this first threshold concept. So I will start a clock for 4 minutes, and I'll check in when we will transition to reading the text excerpt. And if you have any questions, I'll open up the chats now and be checking that out. Okay, we're going to transition on to the text excerpt. So again, we are going through the threshold concept of explicit enculturation, and you are moving on from the description to the text excerpt. So take a moment to read that. And then we're going to, you're going to record your reactions, questions, or connections. So we'll take 5 minutes for that section. Great. We'll come back together. And so if we were in person and had some more time, or if we were facilitating learning group on your campus, we would now share a short video going over James Paul G's concepts of primary and secondary discourse to further reinforce the threshold concept. And then we move on to the discussion questions that you see listed under the section where you were recording your reactions, questions, and connections. So this is just a model of an activity that you can do with your learning group or your colleagues. But again, we really want to emphasize that these are our threshold concepts that we felt were needed for our project of change on campus. But we want to hear from you. And so, Gretchen, do you want to speak a little bit to that?
But before I move on to that, I do want to point out that the understanding of the threshold concepts is one thing, and then you really want to make sure that you're applying it. So we didn't send, but the organizers sent in the email to you all a document called the is it lesson review activity, I think is the title.
Yep.
And so feel free to use that. Again, that's specific to the threshold concepts that we shared, but it's a great activity where it asks you to choose one lesson and then think about that in the context of the threshold concept. So think about explicit enculturation and how it's showing up or not showing up in a lesson. And it does actually have a nice checklist for explicit enculturation. And so again, you can use that on your own lessons. You can share it with your colleagues, or you could just use the format of the activity itself and replace it with your own threshold concepts. And then I wanted to share one anecdote or example from our campus of a threshold concept that we now feel like we need to attend to, just because I think it really brings to light the importance of threshold concepts and understanding. So we've established these threshold concepts, but obviously we still come up against problems at our institution. And one of those problems recently was our diversity, equity, and inclusion vice president sent out an email with an invite to a confronting whiteness conference that was happening on our campus. And she got a response from a faculty member that said that she was being racist against white people. And to me, that really hit me hard in the chest. I was really sad that, first of all, our DEI VP had to experience that communication. But it also made me pause to think, I think that faculty member doesn't understand the threshold concept of whiteness. And I think that he was applying his flawed understanding of what it means to talk about being white to the threshold concept of whiteness and how it's used when we talk about it in terms of social justice. And in that sense, I think that threshold concepts bring me a lot of hope that, there's an issue of we need to teach and train faculty and our colleagues on threshold concepts so that they can engage in the work. And, maybe that faculty member would have had the same response, but at least if we train folks in that threshold concept, they have the opportunity to understand and engage alongside of us. So with that, we would like to just spend a few minutes to have you brainstorm some of the inclusive pedagogy threshold concepts that you think are really critical at your institution. So as you think of them, just share in the chat and we'll read out a few as they pop up. So threshold concepts that relate to inclusive pedagogy on your campus.
Okay, we are learning the chat is disabled for some reason. So that also gives me more hope that it's not just dead silent. So I think instead of trying to problem solve that in real time, we'll move on. But again, with that, we're drawing on our experience of working with other learning groups on other campuses. We do a Winter Deans Institute where chat is now open. So if you want to jump in there and list some threshold concepts, that'd be great. But we do this problem solving activity with many different partners where we identify a barrier to equity on their campus or tension that's occurring within their department, and then work backwards from that on what is the threshold concept that would give us the tools to confront that.
And Kip and I love to talk about threshold concepts. So after this webinar, at any point, if you want to email us with a threshold concept that you want to bring to your campus and you need resources, we would be thrilled to talk about it and brainstorm and help come up with some resources for you.
So please keep adding those as we move on. But I'm going to flip through. We're going to come back to, let me get back to the slides, to questions. We have a secret slide that if we ran out of time, we would keep hidden, but we have time. So we wanted to talk with you when we look at in the role of being leaders in advancing these initiatives on our campus, what we've learned. And I think this will resonate with a lot of folks. And so we wanted to just list these 5 bullets and just talk briefly about them to provide support for you as you move this forward. So the first one, take it away, Gretchen.
So the first one is adaptive leadership. And we think that this is especially important for Prof Tech folks because Prof Tech folks, for really great reasons, are oftentimes focused on technical solutions. So there's a problem, let's solve it. And we've found that we have to give a little bit more space for adaptive leadership and really look at every opportunity as a teaching opportunity. So yes, let's find the technical solution, but also let's be adaptive and really get at the core of the problem.
The next one is looking at that everything that we do is institutional leadership. And again, this is informal and this is in formal roles and in informal roles. It needs to be intentionally designed, structured, and scaffolded. So we talked about that in the teaching and learning aspect, but this is also in the rollout of initiatives. And the example we always share, and bless his heart, I'm going to put him on the spot. When we started this, our VPI said, well, you know, as community and technical college teachers, we're all here for the same reason, for student success. And that is the point where Gretchen and I spit our coffee out and we're like, whoa, 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 whoa. I don't think we know what that even means as a term, that it's a common term. And we are absolutely not all here for the same reason. So we need to do the planning and the structure to make sure that initiatives roll out and are successful and sustainable.
The next one, I'll talk about that one. Yeah. So the next one we talked about earlier. So inclusive pedagogy is an ongoing critical awareness. It's not something that you do once and are done with forever. You have to constantly be reevaluating, and it's an iterative process.
I'll let Gretchen speak to this one too.
And then just that piece and consistency matters. So really making sure that everyone's on the same page, that everyone understands those threshold concepts, that you're using the same language, and that when you use the same language, you're using the same definitions. That piece takes time, but we found that it's really important to attend to that and not just skip over it.
And the final one we want to point out is we have to be self-aware of deficit mindsets. And so this is important on all levels. We point out the deficit mindsets that are, you know, in support of students. So an example of that is, well, of course, my students couldn't turn that assignment on time. That student, I'm aware, is dealing with homelessness. So then instead of providing the support to really go through those learning concepts, get the assignment in and be successful, we make adjustments from them. That's still operating on a deficit mindset, even if it's in the interest, perhaps, of the student. We also need to really continue to apply that critical awareness to ourselves. So no matter how much you may be leading this work on your campus, it's so vitally important to be always reaching out to partners, always continuing your own growth, challenging yourself. And, you know, frankly, that's probably one of the hardest pieces. So Gretchen and I are always looking for the conversations after our presentations because we learn so much more from you in those conversations. So again, I'm going to plug it. We're going to stick around. We're going to unmute everyone. So if you're able to stick around, please chat with us. With that, I'm going to jump back to our questions, and we've got the Q&A section on the bottom of your screen instead of the chat, where you will ask your questions, and Ricardo will be helping out, and we have time for maybe 2 questions, and then we will stick around to go more in depth. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gretchen and Kip. We do have one question. Bob Scribner from Highline says, would you remind us your email addresses?
Yes, that is easy. It's in the slide deck on the second slide, and we will get that emailed out to all participants after this session. And we'll just add it in the chat right now.
Great, thank you. And just a gentle reminder, Kim posted a link to our survey along with upcoming webinars. Look for that just a few minutes ago. Also, Ibinak asks, what is a threshold concept of whiteness, for example, please?
So a great one that we worked on, there's an excellent one-pager, it might actually have 2 pages, that I think we'll share out since I'm referencing it on the concepts of white supremacy. And so it really is looking at behaviors that reinforce white supremacy. And so they're things that, you know, in and of themselves might not be egregious activities, but they help reinforce that status quo of a dominant culture being based in the white culture, defining our teaching, defining our conversations, and defining our interactions at work. So we did some great work with colleagues at Tacoma that were using that document to just really look at their units' interactions to interrupt those patterns in behavior so that voices could be more included.
And the example of that faculty member who, you know, had such a strong reaction to the idea of a training on confronting whiteness was he was understanding the term whiteness as the color of someone's skin, and that was it. You know, he wasn't understanding the history that goes into creating structures of privilege and, like Kip said, all those elements of white supremacy that are present in our current institutions. So it's a whole kind of bag of knowledge that comes along with that term that I think that faculty member hadn't been exposed to and didn't have an understanding of.
Thank you. Callan asks, can you give an example of deficit mindset and how you would address it? I'm assuming you're saying deficit mindset is not good. What's the opposite?
I'm going to kick that to Gretchen because she has a great example for that.
You might have to tell me which example you're thinking. That's so great. But yeah, I have lots of examples. That's a great question. And also, for sure, look into Ben Simone's work. She has a very short, great article that explains it really nicely. But a deficit mindset is always thinking that a student is coming from some type of deficit. So a really kind of blunt one would be, oh, well, the student didn't do well because they're lazy. That's the faculty member coming from a deficit mindset. It's assuming that it's the student's fault for not achieving. But a kind of more nuanced example would be, oh, well, that student wasn't successful because they're having issues, family issues at home. That's also deficit thinking. Instead of going, well, how can I address my curriculum? And this is a strength-based approach. So say, how can I approach my teaching and curriculum so that a student can be successful, even if they are having troubles at home or even if they are homeless. So it's taking ownership. The opposite of a deficit mindset is an equity mindset where you take ownership for student success.
And then, and I think we'll include that reading as well. 1, because we referenced it, and 2, because it's so good. And Ben Simone, just to provide a little bit more background, breaks it into deficit mindset, diversity mindset where you have representation, but the culture doesn't necessarily change and those voices aren't genuinely included. So easy example of that is think of a lot of our colleges brochures where we have the glossy brochure and we put forward the diversity of our students, but we don't necessarily attend to the needs of those students. And then finally, what she advocates for is that equity mindset. So, well, thank you so much. I am going to transition to the last slide and turn it back over to Jamie. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.